While raising numberless hordes of poorly armed, mindless lackeys to attack the soft bastions of the living is a perfectly fine strategy for most necromancers, sometimes it's not enough. Mighty monsters can cut through a seemingly infinite number of lazily animated puppets, and even the most ferocious zombies have difficulty harming heavily armored foes. In times like these, necromancers need to animate more dangerous minions. While gigantic undead terrors or ghastly specters can ravage the elite warriors of the enemy, they require considerable power and knowledge to rouse from the slumber of death. Oftentimes, the easiest solution is to raise the grave guard. The remains of ancient warriors, buried with their arms and armor, they retain much of the combat prowess they possessed in life when raised from the dead. Whatever talent they may have lost to death's cold grasp is easily made up for by their increased strength and durability. This makes them a nightmare to face on the battlefield, their very presence inspiring dread in their foes. One such group of elite wights are the Sternsmen, a graveguard regiment of renown on the Vampire Count's roster. By virtue of oaths sworn before their deaths, the Sternsmen are actually unusually hard for the Vampire Counts of Sylvania to utilize. In life, they had sworn allegiance to the ancient warrior known as Varric the Blade, first castellan of Castle Sternieste. They continued to protect the castle long after their deaths, unable to leave its shadow as long as it still stands. This prevented them from seeing any use in the vampire wars of the past 500 years, as no critical battles took place near the castle. This does not mean that the Sternsmen aren't useful to the von Karstein in some manner, however. They will rise to defend Castle Sternice from anyone who travels too near it with hostile intent, making them an exploitable piece of defensive terrain for the emotionless soldiers of the vampire counts. By tricking their enemies into battling near the castle, a vampire or necromancer can draw the Sternsmen to their banner without expending any of their own precious power. The most famous instance of Sternsman activity occurred in the year 2522 of the imperial calendar, when Volkmar the Grim led a crusade into Sylvania to slay Manfred von Karstein. After exchanging blows with the Empire forces, the vampire decided he needed reinforcements. He managed to maneuver his enemies into the shadow of Castle Sterneist for their ultimate confrontation. The Sternsmen responded to the furious order of the Crusaders, joining the Vampire Count's army to protect the dilapidated fortress. They waited in Manfred's reserves, letting the Empire soldiers tire themselves out butchering wave after wave of zombies before moving in for the kill. They almost succeeded in wiping out the men of the Empire, their cursed weapons cutting through their opponent's pitiful armor, before arcane interventions cost them the day. Balthazar Gelt's weaponization of Sylvania's holy symbols blasted most of the Sternsmen apart with a torrent of holy light, while the few remaining undead were easily dispatched by their surviving state troops. This is the last recorded appearance of the Sternsmen, so perhaps Gelt's magic finally broke their curse and let them rest peacefully. It is more likely, unfortunately, that the Sternsmen later reanimated to continue their cursed watch over Castle Sterneist, until it too was swallowed by the end of the world. In Total War Warhammer, the Sternsmen are the Regiment of Renown Graveguard unit on the Vampire Count's roster. They were introduced alongside Volkmar the Grim and Helman Gorst in the Grim and the Grave DLC pack in Total War Warhammer 1. The Sternsmen cost 1,150 gold in multiplayer, 29 gold less than a normal rank 9 Graveguard. They also possess the expert charge defense and regeneration traits, making them an exceptionally independent unit in the Vampire Count army. Very little magical aid is required to make them function well. Their high armor, shield block chance, decent melee defense, and ability to regenerate without magical assistance makes them very hard to grind down in a battle of attrition. A burst of shock damage can mitigate their regeneration ability as it cannot restore models, but that's what the Invocation of the Heck is for. Getting that burst damage in the first place is difficult as well. Their expert charge defense means you need to get a rear charge to see much success with Shock Cav, and lots of spells don't do enough AP damage to get through their 90 armor value and wipe them off the face of the earth. All in all, the Sternsmen can form a sturdy centerpiece of a battle line, good for cleaning out low to mid-tier infantry while holding the line against non-great weapon high-tier infantry. They shouldn't feel out of place when fighting against any faction. While I'm happy that the Sternsmen are such a good choice in a Vampire Count's army, I'm kind of sad the CA decided to move so far away from the initial design of the Sternsmen. In their Book of Origin, they're actually skeleton warriors with spears and the Screaming Banner instead of Graveguard. So, on one hand, yes, very glad that they did not go with the Skeleton Spearmen Regiment of Renown, because that would be kind of lame. Making them Graveguard was a good move, as it provides more meaningful unit variety and separates them from the Konigstein Stalkers. However, it would have been kind of cool if they'd done some sort of throwback to the fact that the OG Sternsmen had spears and a banner. So maybe, you could give them different abilities than regeneration. They could have had a bonus versus large instead of bonus like infantry, giving the vampire counts a much needed elite monster killer that isn't like another monster. They also, to mimic their banner, they could have been given some sort of AoE debuff that decreases melee attack and melee defense to their foes around them to represent the fear that they instill in their opponents. I mean, it's certainly not happening at this point. It's a Regiment of Renown that was released like 5 years ago. So I'm ultimately just happy that the Sternsmen are a useful unit for the Vampire Count roster as is. This concludes this spooky overview of the Sternsmen. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, stay tuned for future videos. We're going to keep this Spooktober train coming for as long as this month holds out. So yeah, until next time, this has been Sigmar's Chosen, signing off for now.